Welcome everyone to the DC Beer Show. We are at DC Beer across social media. We'd love to see you DC Beer on Instagram, Facebook, and Blue Sky. Less so on Twitter because it's getting weird over there. Mike Stein, what is in your Stein?
Thanks, Jake. I'm drinking VAR from Halfway Crooks. It is VAR, and the packaging is wonderful. They say on the packaging, Beer Pivo Nefiltrovani, which is Czech for unfiltered. So I'm keeping it local. I got VAR, which is a Georgia beer, semi-local, but I got it at the brew shop. Shout out to Beth and Julie, who are Patreon supporters, and they're members of our Patreon. If you don't know, go to patreon.com/DCBeer. Come see about us. Jordan, you traveler, you traveling man on a jet plane. What's going on in your world? What are you drinking?
Hello. Yeah, thank you, Stein. It's been a busy summer. I've been traveling all over. Just the latest was San Diego. Hopefully, you guys get to hear about that later. But because it's been so hot out, and because I've missed home so much, I'm enjoying some Dennis's Brewing Company Born Bohemian Pils. So it's a Czech style Pilsner. Shout out to Stein. I know you love all things Czech. But yeah, Jake, what you sipping on tonight, sir?
So, for our resident beer historian, Mike Stein, do you know what significance July 23rd has in the beer calendar?
Is it International Beer Day?
On July 23rd, 1635, Sir Nicholas Hulse filed a patent for a smoke-free kiln for the drying of hops and malt without touching of smoke. And so on July 23rd, we are recording this on Tuesday, July 23rd, we celebrate Smoke Beer Preservation Day. And so, in honor of Fox Farm having just come into DC, thank you, NRG. Go check them out at the shelter, at Sovereign as well. I have the Cabin, a 5.3% smoked Helles lager. It is delightful, I would say. Go get you some Pailsboro with barbecue. You want to keep it vegetarian or vegan, grilled halloumi. That's what I did earlier today. Big fan. Brandy, what are you drinking?
Hi, DC Beer fam, audience listening. Before I tell you what I'm drinking, I want to say happy early birthday to Miss Julie Verratti. Her birthday's coming up in August, so shout out to Julie and Denizens because you know I love you guys. I am drinking Other Half Poetry Snaps. So, Poetry Snaps is a rice lager. I'm sure you've had Poetry Snaps. They really crush the lagers over there at Other Half. But this week, I'm looking forward to tasting some Citra beers because it is Citra Week at Other Half. And you can go check out all of those Citra Week beers. I think there's like 8 or 9 or 10 beers dropping. I want to know what's going on in the beer world because next Thursday is National IPA Day. We got a bunch of beer celebratory random holidays, and I'm loving the vibes right now. So, what we got, JB?
First up, Aslan set like a land speed record in the DMV. They dropped an Oktoberfest, their fest beer, on July 6th. Today, the 26th, Friday today, they're dropping their Scotch Ale. So, Scotch Ale in July. Do you think we should take like a hot poker to it and extra caramelize those malts, perhaps at an
Oh,
upcoming Metro Bar event?
okay.
The wheels are in motion. All right. But in terms of other stuff that's on the radar, the Olympics are coming up. Jordan, what are you watching for?
Well, in my younger days, I know that's probably funny to hear me say that. But anyway, in my younger days, I was a track athlete. So I'm excited for all of the spring events, specifically the hurdles, as I was a hurdler. So I'm looking forward to see what, Team USA does. I believe our swim team and our gymnastics team will make us all proud. And I hope they do so. So yeah, I'm just looking forward to all of it. Looking forward to kind of the world coming together. Hopefully, it's not as crazy as maybe the past 2 weeks have been, but hopefully it's smooth. How about Sign Brand? You guys looking forward to anything Olympic related?
Oh, for sure. Both Blue Jacket and Atlas are having Olympic specials. So if you're in Navy Yard, Atlas, or on Tingy Street for Blue Jacket down in Southeast, go check out the Olympics there. I had, Jake, some of that aforementioned Aslan Fest beer. And we also saw Atlas's Fest beer at the Drafts and Crafts event. And I had a can or a sixer of Atlas's Fest beer snuck to me. And I have to say that it's really interesting that Aslan went with the more Munich Münchner Pale Fest beer, little hoppy, got a nice kick of the hops. Whereas the Atlas to me reminds me more of Märzen, of that malty special. And we just had the beer share, Brandy, wonderful beer share. Thank you for hosting us so graciously. Thanks to Right Proper Brookland for hosting us. But Brandy, you did a wonderful job there. But I showed some folks the Fest beer, and they were like, "Oh, Fest beer on, what was it, July 21st, whatever the date was, that Sunday." And I was like, "Yeah, when was the last time you had an amber lager?" And they're like, "Oh, yeah, I guess it was July 2023." And I was like, "Yeah, amber lager all year round. Doesn't matter if it's now July. Like, I will have it 12 months, 52 weeks out of the year. Let's go amber lager."
Shout out to Right Proper. Love you guys. Speaking of the beer share, I'm so freaking excited because we had 4 new people come to our beer share this past weekend. We had Josh come and Juan and his wife, and they are now new Patreon members. They had such a great time. They signed up for Patreon. Shout out to Juan for bringing those banging ass chicken skewers. Those were great. We had some good beer as always, and it was just so nice to see new faces. And I want you guys to know that if you think you want to come and you might feel nervous, I understand and I respect that, but you end up having fun. And I'm really thankful. So shout out to Josh and Juan for being our new Patreon members. And we look forward to seeing you guys next month at Denizens. Speaking of, shout out to Denizens for hosting our August beer share, which is going to be on August 11th, which is going to be a crazy busy weekend. That's Saturday in August is our Women's Brew Culture Club. We're back. We took July off. So we're back with Alyssa at Lion Hall. So, you know what? Even though July is my birthday month, I'm ready for August, y'all. I'm just ready to move. I'm just ready to move on.
Well said. It is Leo Virgo season that we are getting into. It's Barrel and Flow. It's Women's Brew Culture Club at Lion Hall. It's the DC Beer Share at Denizens.
One other event that may not have been mentioned, and if it was, just to reiterate, International Beer Day will be next Friday. So it's a number of events happening in and around DC. So check out dcbeer.com for our events and all the updates there, as well as some awesome stories coming out.
We also have the Kolsch Fest at Blue Jacket on July 28th from 12 to 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's happening the day after tomorrow, July 28th. There is going to be some action further in the week at Church Key on July 31st, a week of drinking in one night, Cycle Brewing at Church Key. Cycle out of Florida is bringing some of their favorite stouts, imperial stouts, and barley wines. Not one, but 2 different barley wines. So yeah, check out Church Key on Wednesday, the last day of July.
No. We want to skip that and go straight to the first day of August when at Shelter, Bierstadt Lagerhaus comes to
Ooh.
Shelter.
Ooh.
Everybody, get your slow pour on, a lovely Dunkel, a lovely Helles as well. They also
Women
know a
owned,
thing or
right?
two. Yep, indeed they
Yeah.
are.
Ashley
know-
Carter,
Yeah.
technical
right.
editor of Modern Lager Beer.
Yes.
Should you
That's
enjoy
awesome.
Modern Lager Beer by Jack and Joe, thank Ashley Carter of Bierstadt Lagerhaus. And then go try her beers.
Yeah. But I want to get as far away from lager as possible for a minute. Jordan, you were just in San Diego, where I guess there's lager, but mostly what I think of is I think of IPA. What really stood out in your travels over there?
Well, I don't know if you know if I have enough time. Yeah, it's really an awesome place. I mean, it was chill, like weather was perfect as one would expect. But I'll just list off the places I was able to hit, and then I'll close out quickly with the one that really stood out. But I was able to go to Catch. Catch is they brew beer, but they're mostly known for their food and their fish tacos, which are excellent, by the way. But I try all of the beers that I could there. And actually, their crispy boys came out really well. Uh, Caught Amplified Brewing by the water. I went to their Pacific Beach location. So just kind of had some beers and, enjoyed the boardwalk. Of course, I started with North Park. I mean, no one's surprised
Yeah.
there. When I walked in, two of the guys in the back had on other half shirts. I was like, I feel like I haven't left the East Coast yet. But yeah, so North Park was really great. They had some collabs coming out with Burial down in North Carolina, and they had a couple of other collabs that they were dropping. Went to Fall Brewing just briefly, just kind of just poking my head in there. I was trying to hit as many as possible, but I finished with Pure, which was my favorite. And if not just for like the quality of beer, like specifically their North Park location, like it was just beautiful. Like I got there around like 3 in the afternoon, sat around for like 2 or 3 hours, and it was just chill. Like it was just the music was excellent, like the staff was really nice. Obviously the beers are great. So I would say Pure probably they took the cake. So it was a great trip. Definitely, folks, if you haven't been out there, I would recommend it. Not just a great place for beer, but all things holistic. I think we should have our next DC beer retreat in San Diego. But yeah, up next is Barrel and Flow, and I hope to bring back some awesome tales of awesome people and awesome beer with my lovely co-attendee Amber, because it's going to be she and I. You guys might know her as Paunchy, but she and I will be holding it down for the DC Beer Fest.
Our guest is also well-traveled. I know him best from his work at Schlafly, but he's no stranger to DC. He's at American University. He's been at Heavy Seas before that. Please welcome to the show, Dan Kopman. Stein, take it away.
Thanks, Jake. I'm here with Dan Kopman, who is professional lecturer at American University's Kogod School of Business and a senior policy advisor to the Worldwide Brewing Alliance, who specializes in studying global shifts in the alcohol industry. Dan, welcome to the DC Beer Show.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
It's wonderful to have you here. So I want to let our listeners know, Dan, you most recently, before academia, worked as CEO at Heavy Seas. But before that, you worked in Missouri and in England. Would our listeners, who of course are global citizens and have lived and traveled all over the world, would they have had your beer or beer you brewed in, say, London from 1983 to 1991, or say St. Louis from 1991 to 2017?
Yes, that's the short answer. Yes. So if you lived in London in the 1980s, if you lived in London today, you would find hundreds of Young's pubs in London, and you would be familiar with Young's Original, Young's Special, Young's Winter Warmer, those beers. Many Young's pubs, the pubs are very popular. And then in St. Louis, yes, I was the co-founder of Schlafly Beer. So if you had found yourself even at the airport, just changing planes in the Southwest terminal or the American Airlines terminal, we had pubs in those terminals. So you would have had a pint of Schlafly Pale Ale there, even today. Yes.
That's wonderful. So our listeners will now know, but I want to get a little more granular. As we mentioned, you're at American University's Kogod School of Business. And I had heard you discussing on another podcast about some of the experiential learning projects for the students at AU. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those projects and the exciting work you're doing at Kogod?
So the course that I helped coordinate, I coordinate the Capstone Experiential Learning Project. The Capstone class is a strategy class in which all of our seniors take that as one of their last classes. And part of that is a consulting project. So we work with different companies, big and small, some in the DC area, some others around the world. And we identify problems that those companies are experiencing. And then the students spend a semester working on those problems as consultants. So students move from being students to consultants through the process. So it's a great learning experience for them. And we hope to, at the end of the day, provide actionable advice for the client. So for example, we did do a project with Right Proper Brewing Company in DC. And if there are other breweries in DC that are interested in the Capstone Consulting Project, then by all means, send me an email. It's dankopman@american.edu. And experiential learning is a big part of the business school experience for both undergraduate and graduates.
I would strongly encourage folks to be in touch. I'm wondering, you talk a good bit about early mover advantage. When you were in Schlafly and St. Louis, there was some early mover advantage, and the same with Heavy Seas. In Maryland, they had an IPA, early sort of in the IPA wave that's still cresting. I'm wondering, either locally or even globally, because I know you work a lot in the in international spaces in other countries on other continents, the early mover advantage I see applied to locally in DC brewers like DC Brau, who put a canned seltzer on the market in 2019. They just put DC's first canned NA beer on the market, which is a big deal as we've seen the proliferation of NA beer. But can you tell us a little bit about early mover advantage, and if you can, either look into your crystal ball and see what's coming down the pike, or
Yeah.
talk a little bit about some of those early mover advantages you've seen in your experiential time.
So early mover advantage is intuitively exactly what it is. You're fortunate, you're lucky, you're smart, one of those things, to be an entrepreneur in a market where you're moving into a segment, a category, at a time when others really aren't. And so you have that first mover or early mover advantage. It doesn't guarantee success. It provides a temporary, what I'd call, competitive advantage for a company that does it well. The question is how do you sustain that competitive advantage? That's the harder part. That's the much harder part. And that early mover advantage can last a very short period of time, or it can last a long time. So if you think back to the craft beer business, before the term craft beer existed, there were brewers like ourselves, Schlafly in St. Louis, one of the first couple hundred craft breweries in the United States. We had an early mover advantage, especially in our local market. Now, our local market was unique because it was the home of Anheuser-Busch. So we had that early mover advantage for a very long time, say 1991, all the way until 2008. We were pretty much on our own. And so that gave us a really significant competitive advantage in the craft market for quite a long period of time. But I would say that once the competitors appeared, it got hard fast, right? And I remember back to, it was, I think, a Beer Institute meeting in St. Louis, and Gary Fish, the founder of Deschutes, one of the founders of Deschutes, was in St. Louis, and we were talking about this issue, and he was saying, so what do you do? What are you going to do when there's others? And I said, well, there aren't others at the moment. This was well before 2008. And so it's really a David and Goliath type approach that we took to having that advantage. And then with the sale of Anheuser-Busch to InBev, things changed where there were now other breweries in St. Louis. But Gary got a real taste of this early on because in Oregon, there were so many more brewers in addition to Deschutes that started throughout the 1990s. And there was a bit of a shakeout, if you remember. So that's early mover advantage. Early mover advantage is often coincides with early adopters. So when I talk about early adopters, those are the consumers within an innovation cycle that are your first consumers, right? I used to describe it as I know every drinker because they all came into our pub because honestly, we only sold beer over our own bar for the first 2 years in St. Louis, 91 to roughly 93, because rightly, for all the very good reasons, most bars in St. Louis didn't want to sell a non-Anheuser-Busch beer. The brewery was too good to most bars in St. Louis to sort of, rock that boat. So it often is associated with that. But again, the easy part is getting a competitive advantage by having early mover advantages. The hard part is keeping it.
That's very well said. Easy to get, but it can be lonely at the innovation or progressing forward top of the mountain, and then there's no guarantee. So, yeah, I'm wondering about that in terms of THC or cannabis-based beverages, because I've talked to some brewers. They feel like, okay, they've done well with hard seltzer or making a product, but Of course, they don't want to break the law. They're judicious brewers, so they're waiting on legislature
Yeah,
effectively. And
legislate.
yeah, and this is a big what if question. So
Yeah,
preemptive apology, but the question, we've seen Athletic Brewing Company in the NA space, and I'm kind of drawing a parallel between NA and potentially THC Bev. We've seen Athletic go from a few thousand barrels to I don't know, maybe 200,000. They were at 170,000 barrels year before last. Could we see 200,000 barrels of THC seltzer, beyond beer, bev, whatever, if the legislative landscape goes the way some people think it will?
to step back a second, with Beyond Beer, you have to separate different products into different segments because they're not all the same. So think about it from a consumer standpoint and think about the concept of something that we teach students about, of cognitive dissonance. What I mean by that is, in layman's terms, where your brain gets twisted, right? So if you're talking about an innovation such as seltzer or RTD spirits, these are 4 to 5% alcohol beverage, 4 to 5% ABV beverage alcohol products. So from an ethanol standpoint, there's no dissonance for the consumer. There's just a slightly different flavor. So I think you can group all of those RTDs, whether you call it seltzer or spirit-based RTDs. You can be somewhat agnostic as to where the ethanol comes from. Not entirely, because it does matter. And there are elements of, how are companies marketing these RTDs? Are they marketing them to try and get them with spirits to buy the full strength bottles, or are they marketing them as completely separate brands like Truly or brands like that? So there's not a lot of dissonance there. It's a different flavor, doesn't taste like beer necessarily, but it's 4 to 5% ABV. THC beverages, that's going to be a segment of the THC market. So you would need to think about it in that context. Now, will it expand the market? Will a beverage version of 5 milligrams of THC expand the market of THC consumers? I don't know. So I would think about that differently. Non-alcoholic beer presents a completely different challenge for consumers because there's a lot of cognitive dissonance, right? So you walk into a bar and you may not want to drink ethanol that night for whatever reason, or you've had a beer and you don't necessarily want another one, right? And you see non-alcoholic beer now on the menu and it's the same price, or it's more, or it's a little bit less. And there's a dissonance there. There's a sort of, oh, hold on, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? I need to get my head around. So the number of consumers that actually are consuming non-alcoholic beer, the number of early adopters, is pretty small. So it's a completely different type of innovation, and it's going to have a completely different growth trajectory as a result. Meaning, like craft beer back in the 90s, where we knew every drinker. Athletic, I'm not saying they know every consumer of their product, or Heineken 00, but it's different. And the number of consumers is different. And so while Athletic has that early mover advantage in the United States, they definitely would not have that in Europe. So the most important thing for your audience to know about non-alcoholic beer in the US is that the number of adopters in the US is the lowest in any region of the world. So the penetration of non-alcoholic beer into the US is quite low. It has started to grow pretty dramatically, but it's well behind. So for example, there's 50 plus million barrels in US terms of non-alcoholic beer sold globally. 25 million of that, half of that is Europe. The next largest market is the Middle East and Africa. After that is Latin America, and then Asia Pacific. And then finally you get to North America. So the global rate of growth for non-alcoholic beer is in the high single digits. I'd expect that to continue. We're at about 2.5% of global beer production. But the US is going to be, I think, a big market. but we need to go from early adopters to the early majority. When we go to the early majority of consumers, then we're going to see even higher rates of growth. So to your original question about early mover advantage, we're still there. The companies that are investing now in creating the market are going to have that early mover advantage. The question is, will they be able to sustain that competitive advantage? It doesn't always work that way. If you think about smartphones, the iPhone was not the first smartphone, right? The iPhone was launched into a late early majority, or almost, a late majority of consumers. And that's why the volume was so big for the iPhone. So, the global brewers are all committed to the market. And when I say global, it's the ones we're familiar with, including the Japanese brewers. They're really committed to the market. So I think it's important, if it's something that a DC brewer feels they can be effective in building a market long term, then go for it. But it's going to be the volumes are going to be small right now, especially if you're only in one market. That's going to be the big challenge for local brewers getting into NA beer. The volumes will be small because the number of consumers is small right now.
I really appreciate you putting the US into the global context for how many NA beer drinkers we have from a global market perspective, but then also the idea that there could be great growth, but it will take time, and it will not be, let's say it won't be easy, as all good things worth pursuing are not easy. But it's interesting because I think, I aside from asking you to look into your crystal ball, I now want to look back on the past, because in DC we have an interesting story with the barrels sold, specifically how much beer was sold in 2018 and 2019. We're talking about over 400,000 barrels. This is from the mayor's office. I have a distributor friend who got a report from Bowser's office, and he was letting me know there's about 420,000 barrels in both 2018 and 2019. Obviously, 2020, with the COVID-19 global pandemic, we're down to 303,000 barrels. And in 21, a slight increase, 324,000 barrels. But at the same time, out of those 300,000 plus barrels, DC only brews about, between 30 and 40,000 barrels annually. So how would you recommend DC brewers grow their market, and what do you see in the way of trends and where that might go?
I think this is really interesting. I was looking at some data this morning on small brewers. The World Brewing Alliance, we have a UN beer club, in the same way that, say, the Brewers Association has a small brewers caucus in DC. We have a beer club up in New York, made up of the missions, the missions to the UN. So it was interesting. If I look at global, and I'll come back to DC, I'll bring this back. If I look at global data on small brewers versus the large brewers, there's 15 brewers in the world that individually have more than 1% of the global beer volume, right? And they make up about, call it 75% of global beer volume. So there's still almost 30% of global beer volume is made up by smaller brewers. If I look at the US data, I think it's 13% of US volume is craft, right? So if we think of them, and that's roughly the same number. So you cited, I think, about 10% of DC volume is made up by smaller brewers. So that's consistent with the national average of, say, 13%. So so if the global data and the country data and the local data are all roughly aligned, then that's interesting. And then that number, those global numbers haven't moved a lot in the past 4 or 5 years. Right? It's been in that 10 to 15% of beer volume as smaller brewers. One of the things that I look at really carefully these days is demographic data. So I look at this, especially for a course I teach at AU on global entrepreneurship. And what I find interesting is the demographic data on the US versus, say, Europe. The US population right now has the largest number of legal foreign-born nationals since the late 1800s. 24% of the US population, legal, was not born in the US. The last time the number was that high was the late 1800s. And many people can trace their American heritage back to that time, right? So that's quite interesting. So then you sort of say, okay, where are they coming from, right? Well, yes, a lot have been coming from Mexico and Latin America over the past 20 years. And is there a correlation between that and the growth of Mexican imports? Probably. I haven't run the regression, but my guess is there's a correlation there. But if you look at where they're coming from now, in equal numbers, they're coming from China, Mexico, and India. And so I think that is really interesting. The average age in the US is 36, 37. Average age in Europe is 47. Immigration is holding that average age down in the US. That's good for brewers, right? Younger drinkers, more consumption. We've seen a lot of lost volume of ethanol consumption, beer, wine, and spirits in Europe. I have to think that a lot of that is related to the increasing average age. So if I'm a local brewer, if you think back, 20 years, things have really changed in terms of the consumer base, the total consumer base, what's my potential market? And I think brewers need to take a step back, even local brewers need to take a step back and say, what's my market? And who am I selling to? Because when you think about the total population of DC and you think about, look at the demographics of DC and compare it back to 20 years ago or 10 years ago even. So when a brewer like DC Brow or Right Proper or others started, I have a sneaky suspicion that the demographic picture looked very different. And so maybe the volumes haven't changed in terms of the amount of beer being sold total, but who's buying it is different. And certain things are growing and certain things aren't. And I think that speaks to maybe what Bart Watson or Bob Pease and others at the Brewers Association, people locally, have been saying, that we need to broaden the appeal of beer from small brewers, beverages from small brewers, and we need to consider who our consumers are. So I think I would start there.
Very well said, Dan. Dan, thank you so much for joining us on the DC Beer Show, and we look forward to seeing you around Friendship Heights.
Yes. If anyone has questions, again, about the programs at American University, especially our, not just the academic programs, but the consulting projects and our Center for Entrepreneurship, the Valoric Center for Entrepreneurship, please do not hesitate to email me. Again, it's dankopman@american.edu.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Dan. American University, everyone. Go Eagles. All right, everybody, be well. You're watching the Olympics. Again, I think Blue Jacket and Atlas, probably the two best places to be in terms of beer-centric spots. We are at DC Beer across social media. Brandy, take us out.
Cheers, everybody. Come to the next beer share.